Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we travel back into the world of the ancient Celts, the peoples who once spread across much of Europe, who built round houses upon green hills, who revered the oak and the mistletoe, and who told their stories beside the fire rather than writing them down. Tonight you will hear 100 gentle facts about the ancient Celts, drifting softly one into the next, like mist moving slowly across a quiet green valley at evening. There is no need to follow closely. There is no need to remember anything at all. Simply let the old world rise gently around you. The thatched roundhouses with their warm central fires, the misty groves of oak, the green hills crowned with earthen ramparts, the slow turning of the seasons. The Celts left us few written words of their own, for they trusted their memories and their spoken word above the written page. And so much of their world comes to us softly, in fragments, like a half-remembered dream. Let us begin by asking who the Celts actually were, for they were not a single nation or a single people under one ruler. The Celts were many tribes, scattered across a vast stretch of ancient Europe, who shared a family of related languages, similar customs, similar art, and a similar way of seeing the world. They were bound together not by a king or an empire, but by a common culture and by tongues that were cousins to one another, spoken across great distances. At the height of their world, more than 2,000 years ago, Celtic peoples and Celtic languages stretched across an enormous span of Europe. They lived in the lands we now call Ireland and Britain, across France, which the Romans called Gaul, into Spain, through the heart of Central Europe, and even far to the east, into what is now Turkey, where a Celtic people called the Galatians settled. It was one of the most widespread cultures of ancient Europe, reaching from the Western Ocean almost to the edge of Asia. The very name Celt comes to us from the ancient Greeks, who called these northern peoples the Celtoi. The Romans, encountering them in the lands to their north, often called them Gauls. But the Celts themselves were divided into a great many tribes, each with its own name, its own territory, its own leaders, and its own loyalties. They did not think of themselves as one people. so much as many peoples who happened to share a way of life and a family, of tongues. The Celtic languages still survive in the world today, which is a quiet wonder, for they are among the living echoes of that ancient world. The tongues spoken now in Ireland, in Scotland, in Wales, in the Isle of Man, in Cornwall, and in Brittany in France are all descended from the languages of the ancient Celts. When someone speaks Irish or Welsh today, they're speaking a tongue whose roots reach all the way back to the Iron Age peoples we are visiting tonight. The world of the Celts belonged to what we call the Iron Age, the long age after people had learned to work iron, making from it strong tools and weapons. The Celts were skilled ironworkers, and iron tools allowed them to clear the dense forests, to plough the heavy soils, and to farm the land more richly than before. Their swords, their ploughshares, their tools, and their cauldrons were forged from iron at glowing hearths by skilled smiths who were held in high regard. The roots of Celtic culture are often traced to two early centres, known to scholars by the names of the places where their remains were first found. The earlier of these grew up around a place in the mountains of Central Europe called Hallstatt, famous for its salt mines, where the Celts dug deep for the precious salt that preserved food and was traded far and wide. The salt, in fact, preserved more than food, for it has kept the wooden tools, the clothing, and even the bodies of ancient miners remarkably well, deep in the old shafts, giving us a rare window into their distant lives. From this place, the whole early phase of Celtic culture takes its name. The chieftains and nobles of this early Celtic age were sometimes laid to rest in grand fashion, buried beneath great mounds of earth along with their finest possessions, and even with whole wagons or carts. In one famous grave, a chieftain was laid upon a bronze couch with his drinking horns and a great cauldron, dressed in fine cloth, equipped for feasting in the next world. In another, a noble lady was buried with a torc of gold and an enormous bronze vessel for wine, traded all the way from the distant Greek world. The later flowering of Celtic culture is named after a site by a lake in Switzerland called La Tène, and it gave its name to a style of art so beautiful and so distinctive that we still recognize it at a glance. This was an art of flowing curves and spirals, of swirling abstract patterns, of stylized animals and plants curling into one another, full of movement and life. It decorated their weapons, their jewelry, their mirrors, and their finest objects. And it is one of the great glories of the ancient Celtic world. Now, when we think of the ancient Celts, many people picture the great standing stones and stone circles, like the famous one upon the plain in southern Britain. But here is a gentle surprise, for those great stone circles are far older than the Celts. They were raised by earlier peoples, long before the Celts ever arrived, in the ages of stone and bronze, 1,000 years and more before the Celtic tongues were heard in those lands. The Celts did not build them, and yet the Celts lived among these ancient stones, which were already old and mysterious even in their time. And it is likely that they too felt the wonder of them and wove their own meanings and stories around them. In much later ages, people came to imagine that the Druids, the Celtic priests, had built and used these great circles. But this was a romantic idea of more recent centuries, not a true memory. The stones were ancient mysteries to the Celts, just as they are to us. The Celts did, however, raise standing stones and carved stones of their own. And in Ireland especially, they later set up tall stones, marked along their edges with an early form of writing made of simple notches and lines. These carved pillars stand in the green fields of Ireland still, their edges nicked with the strokes of an ancient alphabet, marking perhaps a name or a memorial. So the Celts had their own stones, even if the greatest of the old circles belonged to peoples who had come long before. Upon a green hillside in southern Britain, there lies a wonder that does seem to belong to this Iron Age world. A great horse carved into the chalk of the hill, its lines cut through the turf to show the white stone beneath. This hill horse is enormous, stretching along the slope, drawn in the same flowing, abstract, elegant style as the finest Celtic metalwork, all sweeping curves and motion. It has been kept clear and bright for thousands of years by the people of the land, who return to clean and re-chalk it, and it gallops still across its hill today. In the far north of Britain, in the lands the Romans never fully conquered, there lived a people the Romans called the Picts, a name that may mean the painted ones, perhaps from their custom of painting or tattooing their bodies. In later centuries, these northern people carved tall stones covered with mysterious symbols, beasts, and patterns, whose exact meanings are lost to us. These carved symbol stones still stand in the green Scottish landscape, beautiful and enigmatic, the quiet work of a proud northern people. Let us turn now to how the Celts actually lived, day by day, in their green and misty lands. Most Celts lived in the countryside, in farms and small settlements, for they were above all a rural people, close to the land and the seasons. The great cities of the Mediterranean world were not their way. Instead, they lived in scattered homesteads and villages, among their fields and their cattle, following the slow rhythm of ploughing and sowing and harvest, of summer pasture and winter shelter. The classic home of the ancient Celts was the roundhouse, a circular dwelling with walls of timber, or of wattle and daub, or of stone, and a tall, conical roof of thatch rising. To a point, these houses could be surprisingly large and comfortable, with a single great round room within. There were no separate floors or many small rooms, but one warm circular space where the whole family lived, worked, cooked, and slept, gathered around the fire at the center. At the heart of every roundhouse burned the hearth. A fire kept going in the middle of the floor, giving warmth and light and a place to cook. There was no chimney, and the smoke rose up and drifted out slowly through the thatch of the roof, which helped to keep the thatch dry and free of insects. The fire was rarely allowed to go out entirely, and its glow was the warm heart of the home through the long, dark, and often cold nights of the northern year. The doorway of a Celtic roundhouse very often faced toward the rising sun in the southeast, away from the cold winds and the rain that came from the other direction and toward the morning light. This careful placing of the door shows a thoughtful attention to the sun and the weather, letting in the warmth and light of the morning, while turning the back of the house against the worst of the storms. Such small wisdoms shaped the comfort of daily life. The walls of many a roundhouse were made by a craft called wattle and daub, in which thin branches were woven between upright posts to make a kind of basket-work wall then plastered over with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and dung, which dried hard and kept out the wind and the rain. It was a simple, clever way of building, using only what the land freely gave, and a well-made roundhouse, snug and warm, with its thick thatched roof and its central fire, could be a comfortable home through the hardest of winters. Within such a home lived the family, and Celtic children grew up close to the work of the household and the farm, learning by helping and watching, herding the animals, fetching water and wood, and listening in the evenings to the tales and songs of their elders by the fire. There were toys for the little ones, and games, and the warm closeness of a family gathered in a single round room around the glowing hearth, the firelight flickering on the faces, and the rain falling soft upon the thatch overhead. The Celts were skilled farmers, and farming was the foundation of their whole way of life. They grew grains such as wheat, barley, oats, and rye, which they ground into flour for bread and porridge, and brewed into ale. They kept cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats, and raised horses. The work of the year followed the seasons, the ploughing and sowing in spring, the tending through summer, the harvest in autumn, and the careful management of the herds and stores through the hungry winter. The Celtic year was sharply divided between the light half and the dark half, between summer and winter, and the great change came as the herds were driven out to the high summer pastures in the warm months, and brought back down to shelter near the homesteads for the cold ones. In summer, the green land was full of growth and labour and long, bright days. In winter, the people drew close around their fires, living on what they had stored, while the cold rains and the snows passed. Over the quiet land, life moved with this great breathing of the seasons, out and in, light and dark. There was a custom among the warriors, before a great battle, of stepping forward to boast of their deeds and their lineage, and sometimes of challenging a champion of the enemy to single combat between the gathered armies. The Celts loved fine words and bold speech, and a warrior's reputation, sung by the bards, was among his most treasured possessions. To fight well, to speak well, and to be generous were the marks of a noble Celt, and the winning of honour and fame was held dearer even than life itself. Cattle were especially precious to the Celts, so precious that a person's wealth was often counted in the number of cattle they owned, rather than in coins or gold. Cattle gave milk, meat, leather, and labor, and they were the very measure of riches, because cattle were so valuable. The raiding of another tribe's cattle was a common and even celebrated act, and one of the greatest of all the ancient Irish tales. The cattle raid of Cooley tells of a mighty war fought between two provinces over a single magnificent brown bull, a tale at the very heart of the old Irish stories. The Celts stored their precious grain in clever ways, sometimes in raised granaries, and sometimes in deep pits dug into the ground and sealed, where the grain could keep for a long time. They built tall posts to hold storehouses up off the damp ground and away from the mice, and they preserved their food against the lean months with salt and smoke and drying. The careful storing of food was, as in every ancient society, the quiet foundation that allowed the people to survive the winter. The food of the ancient Celts was simple, hearty, and nourishing, built around bread and porridge made from their grains, and stews and broths simmered in great cauldrons over the fire. They ate the meat of their animals, especially pork, of which they were said to be very fond, along with milk, cheese, butter, eggs, vegetables, wild fruits, nuts, and honey. It was the plain, warming food of a farming people, made rich by the feast on special days. The cauldron held a special place in Celtic life and imagination. The great metal pot that hung over the fire and fed the whole household. Around the cauldron the family gathered, and from it came the warm stews and broths that nourished them. The cauldron appears again and again in Celtic myth as a magical vessel, a cauldron of plenty that could never be emptied, or a cauldron that could even restore life. So deeply was this humble cooking pot woven into their sense of nourishment and abundance. The Celts loved to feast, and the feast was one of the great occasions of their social life, a time of eating, drinking, music, boasting, and storytelling that could go on long into the night. They drank ale brewed from their grain, and mead made from fermented honey, a sweet and ancient drink much loved by the Celts, who kept bees and prized their honey both for sweetening food and for brewing. The wealthy also imported fine wine from the Mediterranean lands to the south, paying for it dearly, and great quantities of wine flowed northward into the Celtic world, the jars in which it travelled turning up across the Celtic lands, the feasting hall, loud with talk and song and the crackle of the great fire, was the warm centre of the community's life. There was a curious custom at the Celtic feast, the giving of the finest portion of meat, the champion's portion, to the greatest warrior present. This was a high honour, but it could also lead to fierce disputes, for more than one warrior might claim to be the bravest, and quarrels over who deserved the choicest cut were remembered in the old stories. The feast, then, was not only a time of merriment, but a place where honour and rank were displayed and defended. Now, let us speak of how Celtic society was ordered. For though they had no single empire, their tribes were carefully arranged. At the top of each tribe was a king or a chieftain, a leader chosen for his strength, his wisdom, and his noble birth, who ruled with the council of the nobles around him. Below the king were the warrior nobles, then the free farmers and craftsmen, and a special and honoured class of learned people, of whom we shall hear much more soon. The bonds of kinship and tribe were the very framework of Celtic life, and a person's identity was tied closely to their family, their clan, and their tribe. Loyalty ran along these lines of blood and belonging, and disputes were often settled within the tribe according to ancient custom and law. A person was never simply alone, but always part of a web of kin and obligation, protected by their people and bound to them in turn. In Ireland, the tribes and their kings were arranged in a kind of ladder of rank, with lesser kings owing loyalty to greater ones, and above them the kings of the great provinces, and, in legend at least, a high king over all, whose seat was upon the ancient hill of Tara. Whether the high kingship was ever truly as grand as the later tales remembered it, the hill of Tara, with its old mounds and earthworks, remained a deeply sacred place of kingship and assembly, where, it was said, the rightful king was made. The Celts had elaborate systems of law, passed down by memory and custom rather than written in books, and administered by their learned class. These laws covered every part of life, from property and marriage to injury and debt, and they often worked through the payment of compensation rather than harsh punishment, with carefully reckoned fines for various wrongs. It was a sophisticated system of justice, carried entirely in the trained memories of those who kept it. Among the ancient Celts, women often held a higher and freer position than in many other ancient societies of the time. Celtic women could own property, could lead, and in some cases could even take up arms. The Romans and Greeks, whose own women lived more confined lives, sometimes remarked with surprise upon the boldness and independence of Celtic women, and the old tales are full of powerful queens, warrior women, and goddesses of great strength. The most famous of all the Celtic women was a queen named Boudica, who ruled a tribe in eastern Britain and who rose up in a great revolt against the power of Rome. When the Romans wronged her and her people, she led a vast uprising, and her tribes burned several Roman towns before she was at last defeated. She has been remembered ever since as a symbol of fierce resistance and of the proud spirit of the Celtic peoples in the face of a mighty empire. Now we come to the most famous and mysterious figures of the whole Celtic world, the Druids. The Druids were the learned class of the Celts, far more than simply priests, for they were also the judges, the teachers, the healers, the philosophers, the keepers of law, and the advisors of kings. They were held in the very highest esteem, and their word carried enormous authority, sometimes greater even than that of the kings themselves. A king might take no great action without the counsel of his Druids, and it was the learned ones who oversaw the making of a king, the sacred rituals by which a chieftain was set in his place. So great was their standing that it was said a Druid might even step between two armies drawn up for battle and, by his word alone, command them to lay down their arms and make peace and be obeyed. The Druids stood, in a sense, above the divisions of the tribes, for their learning and their sacred office were honored everywhere, across many tribes and territories. A young person seeking to become a Druid might travel far to study with a renowned teacher, and the most famous centers of Druid learning drew students from distant lands. In this way, the Druids formed a kind of shared learned class that bound the scattered Celtic peoples together beyond the loyalties of any single tribe. Through their common wisdom and their common sacred law. To become a Druid was the work of many years, for they committed everything to memory, learning by heart the vast store of their people's lore, history, poetry, ritual, and knowledge of the natural world. It is said that the training could take as long as 20 years. The Druids deliberately did not write their teachings down, believing that the sacred knowledge should live in the trained memory and the spoken word, not be fixed and frozen upon the page. Not all the learned ones were men, but there are mentions in the old accounts of women. Among the Druids and the seers, wise women, prophetesses, and keepers of sacred knowledge. In a society where women could hold property and even lead in war, it is no surprise that women too could be counted among the wise and the learned, the figures of powerful, knowing women run all through the Celtic world, in its history, its goddesses, and its tales, because the Druids wrote nothing down, and because their world has largely passed away. Much about them remains a mystery to us, and we must rely on what others, such as the Romans, wrote about them, and on the echoes in later tales. This is part of why the Druids have always seemed so shadowy and so fascinating. Figures of deep wisdom glimpsed only dimly through the mists of time, keepers of secrets that were never written and so were mostly lost. The Druids held certain trees and plants as sacred, and above all, they revered the oak, the mighty and long-lived tree of the forest. Their gatherings and ceremonies were often held not in temples of stone, but in sacred groves, quiet clearings among the trees, open to the sky, a holy place the Celts called a nemeton, to worship beneath the open heavens, among the living trees, rather than within walls of stone, suited the deep Celtic feeling that the divine dwelt in nature itself, in the oak and the spring and the grove, rather than in any building made by human hands. The very word Druid may be connected to an old root meaning the oak, or knowledge of the oak, binding these wise ones forever to the great trees beneath, which they gathered. One famous account tells of a Druid ceremony involving mistletoe, the strange plant that grows high in the branches of trees green even in the dead of winter, and especially prized when it grew upon an oak, which was rare. A Roman writer described white-robed Druids climbing the sacred oak to cut the mistletoe with a golden sickle, catching it in a white cloth, so it would not touch the ground, for they believed this evergreen plant held great healing power, and called it the all-healer. The same account tells of 2 white bulls brought for the ceremony, and of solemn feasting beneath the oak, the whole rite carried out with great reverence for the sacred plant that grew, green and buried, high in the bare winter branches. The Druids were keen watchers of the heavens and keepers of the calendar, tracking the movements of the sun and moon to know the proper times for the festivals and the seasons. They were thought to have deep knowledge of the stars, of the cycles of time, of the workings of nature, and of medicine drawn from herbs and plants. Their learning bound together what we might now call religion, science, law, and poetry into a single great body of wisdom, all carried in memory. The Druids taught that the soul did not die with the body, but passed on, living again in another form. This belief in the immortality of the soul was noticed by Roman writers, who thought it helped to explain the famous courage of Celtic warriors who seemed to face death in battle without fear if the soul simply passed on to another life. Then death was not an ending to be dreaded, but a doorway. And this gave the Celts a remarkable boldness in the face of danger. Alongside the Druids were the bards, the poets and singers of the Celtic world, who were also held in high honour. The bards composed and recited poetry, sang the praises of kings and heroes, kept the genealogies and histories of the tribes, and provided music and entertainment at the feasts. A bard's praise could lift a person's reputation, and a bard's mockery, his satire, was genuinely feared, for a sharp verse could wound a proud noble's honour more deeply than a blade. The bards preserved the memory of the people, the long lists of ancestors, the deeds of the heroes, the great tales of gods and battles, all held in trained memory and passed from one generation to the next in song and verse. In a world that wrote little down, the bard was the living library of the tribe, the keeper of its past and the weaver of its stories. Through the bards, The Celts remembered who they were. Music was woven through Celtic life, and they played instruments such as the lyre and the harp, the pipe, and various horns and trumpets. The harp in particular became deeply associated with the Celtic lands and remains to this day a beloved symbol of Ireland. The sound of strings and pipes filled the feasting halls and the firelit evenings, accompanying the songs of the bards and the dancing, and the long tales told through the dark hours of the night. So beloved was the harp that it became, in time, the very emblem of Ireland. And to this day, a harp appears upon the symbols of that land. One of the few nations in the world to carry a musical instrument as its badge, a gentle inheritance from the music-loving Celts. The Celts delighted in language itself, in clever speech, in riddles and word play, and the artful turning of a phrase. Their poets prized not only the matter of a poem, but its sound and its craft, the patterns of its words, and a well-made verse was admired as a kind of treasure in a world that carried its learning in memory and its history in song. Words were powerful things, and the gift of fine and fitting speech was honoured. Among the very highest of gifts, let us turn now to the festivals that marked the turning of the Celtic year. For the Celts measured their year by 4 great festivals, tied to the seasons and the rhythms of farming and herding. These were times of gathering, of fire, of feasting, and of ceremony, marking the great hinges of the year. The Celtic year, in fact, was reckoned in a way different from ours, and its festivals still echo in changed forms in some of the holidays we keep today. The first and perhaps greatest of these festivals, called Samhain, fell at the start of November, marking the end of the harvest and the beginning of the dark half of the year. This was a time when the herds were brought in from the summer pastures, when the last of the harvest was gathered, and when the Celts believed that the boundary between this world and the other world grew thin, so that the spirits of the dead and the beings of the other world might draw near. From this ancient festival in time came our Halloween. On this night, when the veil between the worlds was thinnest, the Celts lit great bonfires upon the hills, and it is thought that people may have left out food and drink to welcome the spirits of their ancestors, or disguise themselves so as to pass unnoticed among any wandering spirits. From these old customs, carried down and changed across the centuries, grew many of the things we still do at Halloween: the lighting of lamps, the costumes and disguises, the offerings of food at the door. The hollowed lanterns we carve today are a distant echo of those ancient autumn fires. For all its mystery, this was above all a gathering time when the scattered people came together at the close of the year, when accounts were settled, when the herds were sorted and some animals slaughtered for the winter store, and when the community feasted together before the long, dark months ahead. Beneath the talk of spirits and the thinning veil lay a very practical turning point of the farming year, the drawing in of the people and their beasts against the coming of winter. This great festival was, in a sense, the Celtic New Year, for the Celts seem to have counted the new year as beginning with the dark season, with winter, rather than with the spring or the longest day. To them, the year began in darkness and grew toward light, much as they counted each single day as beginning at sunset, with the night coming before the day. There is something restful in that idea, that the year and the day alike begin in the quiet dark. The festival at the start of February, called Imbolc, marked the first stirrings of spring, the lengthening of the days, and the coming of new lambs and the first milk of the ewes. It was associated with a beloved goddess named Brigid, and later with a saint of the same name. And it was a time of hope, of light returning, of the very first signs that the long winter was loosening its grip and that life was beginning to stir again beneath the cold ground. The festival at the start of May, called Beltane, was a great fire festival, celebrating the coming of summer and the return of the herds to the open pastures. Great bonfires were lit, and it is said that the cattle were driven between two fires as a way of blessing and protecting them before they went out to the summer grazing. People too passed near the fires and leapt over them in hopes of protection and good fortune. And the night was one of joy at the warming and greening of the world. The festival at the start of August, called Lugnasad, celebrated the beginning of the harvest, the first fruits of the year's labour, and was named after a great god of the Celts called Lugh, a bright and many-skilled deity honoured across the Celtic world. It was a time of gatherings, of fairs, of games and contests and horse races, of trading and feasting, when the scattered communities came together in celebration before the hard work of bringing in the full harvest. These 4 festivals, spaced through the year, gave a steady rhythm of gathering and gladness to the Celtic seasons. At the great assemblies that gathered at such times, especially in Ireland, there was far more than feasting, for these were occasions when laws were proclaimed and disputes settled, when marriages were arranged and bargains struck, when there were horse races and contests of strength and skill, and when the bards competed in song and story. The whole scattered people came together, and for a few bright days the quiet countryside filled with the noise and colour of the gathered tribes. The Celts had a remarkable calendar, and one ancient bronze calendar that has survived, found in France, shows just how sophisticated their reckoning of time was. It tracked the months by the moon while keeping in step with the sun, marking the days as lucky or unlucky, and dividing the month around its bright and dark halves. It is a beautiful proof that the Druids and their fellow learned ones were careful and skilled keepers of the cycles of time. This great bronze calendar spread its reckoning across a cycle of 5 years, carefully fitting the months of the moon to the longer course of the sun by adding an extra month from time to time, so that the seasons and the festivals would always fall at their proper times. To work all this out and cast it in bronze was the achievement of a sophisticated and patient science of the heavens. The Celts, in fact, reckoned their time by the night rather than the day, counting nights where we count days, and beginning each day at sunset, with the darkness coming before the light. We keep a faint echo of this old way even now, when we speak of a fortnight, a span of 14 nights, for a period of 2 weeks. To the Celts, the dark was not something to be feared and pushed back, but the natural beginning of things, out of which the light was born. Now let us speak of the gods and spirits of the ancient Celts, for they worshipped many. The Celts were polytheists, honouring a great many gods and goddesses, some known across wide regions and others local to a single tribe, a single hill, or a single spring. Hundreds of names of Celtic deities have come down to us, many of them known from only a single place, for the divine to the Celts was woven into the particular features of their own land. Among the gods whose names we know was Lugh, a bright and many-skilled god honoured widely across the Celtic world, and the Dagda, a great father god with his club and his magical cauldron of plenty. There was Cernunnos, a horned god associated with animals, forests, and the wild, often shown sitting cross-legged with antlers upon his head. There was Brigid, tied to poetry, healing, and the forge, and the Morrigan, a fierce goddess of battle who could take the form of a crow. There was Epona, a horse goddess much beloved, and Taranis, a god of thunder who carried a wheel, a magnificent object found in a bog in Denmark, a great silver cauldron worked all over with images of gods, beasts, and ceremonies, is one of the richest glimpses we have into this Celtic divine world. Upon it appears a horned figure sitting cross-legged among the animals, holding a torc and a serpent, and many other strange and wonderful scenes, made with marvellous skill and laid down as some great offering long ago. It has kept its images bright through 2,000 years. In the dark, wet peat, water was especially sacred to the Celts, and they believed that rivers, lakes, springs, and wells were holy places where the divine drew near, and where one might reach the other world. They made offerings to the waters, casting precious things into rivers and lakes and bogs. Beautiful swords, shields, cauldrons, and ornaments, given to the gods of the deep. Many of the finest Celtic treasures we have today were found in just such watery places, where they had lain as offerings for 2,000 years. From the bed of the river Thames, in Britain came a magnificent bronze shield, worked with swirling patterns and set with red glass, and a horned helmet of bronze, both cast into the water long ago as gifts to the gods, to give a thing of great beauty and value. To the river was, for the Celts, an act of deep devotion, and the dark waters kept these treasures safe through all the centuries until our own. The springs and wells held a special holiness, often thought to have healing powers, watched over by their own gods or spirits. People came to these sacred waters to seek health and blessing, leaving offerings beside them. This deep reverence for holy wells lasted long, after the Celtic gods themselves were forgotten, surviving into much later ages, when the old sacred springs were given the names of saints, but were still visited and honoured as places of quiet power. The Celts held a striking belief about the human head, which they regarded as the seat of the soul and the very centre of a person's being and power. In their art, the human head appears again and again, and in war they were known to take the heads of fallen enemies, believing that in the head resided the spirit and the strength of the person. Strange as this seems to us, it came from a deep belief in the head as the dwelling place of the soul. In Celtic art, the human head appears carved in stone and worked in metal over and over again, often three faces together, gazing out in all directions. The head, to the Celts, held the essence of a person, and so it was honoured, kept, and shown again and again in their carving and their craft, a quiet sign of how differently they saw the seat of the self. The Celts held certain trees sacred beyond the oak, each with its own meaning, and the old law is full of them. The yew, dark and long-lived, was tied to death and to eternity. The hazel was the tree of wisdom, its nuts thought to hold deep knowledge, as in the tail of the salmon. The rowan offered protection. The holly stayed green through the winter, and the apple was linked to the other world and its isles. The forest, to the Celts, was not merely wood and shade, but a living web of meaning and power. The Celts saw the divine and the magical in the animals around them, and certain creatures held special meaning. The boar stood for courage and the fury of battle, and its image adorned helmets and war trumpets. The horse was honoured and loved. The raven and the crow were linked with battle and with a fierce goddess. The salmon was a symbol of deep wisdom, and there is a beautiful old Irish tale of a salmon of knowledge that had eaten the nuts of a sacred tree and so held all the wisdom of the world, and of a young hero who gained that wisdom by chance while cooking the fish. The stag with its branching antlers, was tied to the wild and to the horned god of the forest, and the raven and the hound, the bull and the boar, all carried their own deep meanings in the Celtic mind, the natural world alive everywhere with spirit and significance. The Celts were great keepers of dogs, and their hunting hounds were famous and prized. Tall, swift dogs that could course the deer and the boar through the woods and over the hills. Hunting was both a way of gathering food and a noble sport, beloved by the warriors and the nobles, who took to the forests with their hounds and spears, after the wild boar and the red deer. A fine hound was a treasured companion, and the great hounds of the Celtic lands were valued so highly that they were sometimes sent as splendid gifts to distant kings. Now, let us return to the great art of the Celts, for they were amongst the finest craftsmen and metal workers of the ancient world. Their style of flowing, swirling, abstract decoration covered their finest objects with curves and spirals, and stylized creatures that seem almost to move before the eye. They worked in gold, silver, bronze, and iron, and they delighted in fine enamel work, setting glowing red and other colours into their metal to brighten it. One of the most distinctive of all Celtic ornaments was the torc, a stiff ring worn around the neck, often beautifully made of twisted strands of gold or other metal with decorated ends. The torc was a mark of high status and importance, worn by nobles, warriors, and the wealthy, and even given to the gods as an offering. A famous ancient statue of a dying Celtic warrior shows him wearing nothing but such a torc about his neck, a sign of his rank and pride. The Celts loved spirals and threefold patterns, and one of their favourite designs was the triple spiral, 3 coils joined together, and other patterns built around the sacred number 3. Threeness ran deep in the Celtic mind, appearing in their art, their gods, who often came in threes, and their stories. The flowing knots and spirals of Celtic art would echo on for centuries and can still be seen much later in the beautiful decorated pages of early Irish manuscripts. This love of the number 3 ran very deep in the Celtic world, far beyond their art. Their gods often came in threes, or had 3 faces, or 3 forms. Their goddesses of war, of the land, and of poetry frequently appeared as three sisters, who were somehow also one. Their tales delight in threes, in three brothers, three trials, 3 days. There was something in the threefold that felt complete and powerful to the Celtic mind, and the triple spiral, 3 curves flowing out from a single center, became one of their most enduring and beloved symbols. The Celts were masters of working gold, and many hoards of beautiful Celtic gold have been found. Torcs and bracelets and ornaments of great delicacy and skill. They mined and panned for gold in their lands, and shaped it into objects of wonderful craftsmanship. The glint of gold at the throat and wrists of a Celtic noble, worked into the swirling patterns they loved, was a sign of wealth, of status, and of the high artistry of their smiths. The Celts also made fine mirrors of polished bronze, their backs engraved with elaborate swirling patterns, and beautiful enamelled brooches to fasten their cloaks, and decorated scabbards for their swords, and ornamented helmets and shields. Even the everyday objects of the wealthy were often made beautiful. For the Celts had a deep love of ornament and pattern, and brought their flowing art to bear on the things of daily life, as well as on their sacred treasures. Now let us speak of the Celts as warriors, for they were famous and feared fighters throughout the ancient world. The Celtic warrior fought with a long iron sword, with spears, and with a tall shield, often oval and made of wood. The nobles prized fine weapons and armor, and a good sword was a treasured possession. War and the winning of honor in battle were central to the values of the warrior aristocracy, and brave deeds were the surest path to fame and standing. The Celts had a number of customs in war that startled their enemies. Some warriors were said to go into battle with their hair stiffened with lime into spikes and their bodies painted. In some regions, with a blue dye made from a plant called woad. Some, it was said, even fought without armor or clothing, trusting in their courage alone. These fierce displays were meant to show bravery and to strike awe into the foe before the fighting even began. Yet the Celts were also skilled and inventive armourers, and they are widely credited with the invention of chainmail, the flexible armour made of thousands of small iron rings linked together, which protected the body while allowing free movement. This was a remarkable invention, and like so much else from the Celts, it was taken up by the Romans and spread across the ancient world, worn by soldiers for many centuries to come. The humble iron ring, linked into a shirt of mail, was a Celtic gift to the art of war. The Celts also worked iron into fine helmets, sometimes crested with the figures of birds or boars, and into long, slashing swords and the iron tips of their spears. They bound the wooden wheels of their carts and chariots with iron rims, a clever craft that made the wheels far stronger and longer lasting in their mastery of iron, in war and in peace alike. The Celts were among the most skilled metalworkers of the ancient European world. The Celts of Britain were known for fighting from chariots, light, two-wheeled carts drawn by swift ponies, from which a warrior could hurl spears and dash along the line of battle before leaping down to fight on foot. The skill of the Celtic charioteers amazed their enemies, who described how a warrior could run out along the chariot pole and back even as the ponies galloped. The rattling charge of the war chariots was a famous and frightening sight. So treasured were the chariots that some Celtic nobles were buried in them, laid to rest in their graves along with the chariot, the harness, and sometimes the horses, equipped for the next world. In parts of Britain, archaeologists have found such chariot burials. The dead laid in or upon the dismantled chariot, with their finest goods about them. To be buried with one's chariot was a mark of great honour and high rank, a sign of a noble life of war, and pride carried in belief beyond death itself. The Celts also had a remarkable war trumpet called the carnix, a tall instrument held upright so that it towered above the heads of the warriors, with its end shaped like the head of a boar or other beast, its open mouth raised high into the air. When many of these were sounded together, they made a harsh, blaring din that echoed over the battlefield, meant to hearten the Celts and to fill their enemies with dread before the clash of arms. The fame of Celtic warriors spread far, and Celtic war bands ranged widely across the ancient world. Long ago, a force of Celts marched into Italy and even sacked the city of Rome itself. A humiliation the Romans remembered for centuries. Other Celtic peoples pushed into Greece, and still others crossed all the way into Asia Minor, in what is now Turkey, where they settled and gave their name to the land. of Galatia, keeping their Celtic tongue and customs for centuries far from their homeland. It is a remarkable thing that a people from the west of Europe should have planted a lasting Celtic country so far to the east. For a time, the Celts were among the most feared and far-ranging peoples of the whole ancient world. The Celts were not only fighters, of course, but skilled boatmen who crossed the rivers and seas of their world in vessels of many kinds, including light boats made of a wooden frame covered with hides, called coracles, round and bobbing, which a single person could carry upon their back. In these and in larger craft, the Celts fished the rivers and the coasts, traded along the waterways, and crossed between the islands and the mainland. The water was a road as much as a barrier in the Celtic world across the soft, wet ground of the marshes and bogs, where a cart or a walker might sink and be lost. The Celts and the peoples before them laid down long wooden trackways, roads of split timber and planks resting on the soft earth to carry them safely over. Some of these ancient wooden ways have been found preserved in the bogs. The very planks the ancient people walked upon still lying where they were laid, a quiet path through the marsh from one patch of dry land to the next, made by patient hands long ago. Let us turn to how the Celts dressed and adorned themselves, for they loved fine clothes and bright colours. They wore garments of wool and linen, the men often in tunics and trousers, and the women in long dresses, with cloaks fastened at the shoulder by decorated brooches. They wove their cloth in bright colours and in checked and striped patterns. An early ancestor of the tartans and plaids still loved in the Celtic lands today. The weaving of cloth was a great household craft of the Celtic world. The wool sheared from the sheep, washed, combed, and spun into thread upon a hand spindle, then woven upon an upright loom, whose threads were held taut by hanging weights of clay or stone. The Celts dyed their wool with colours drawn from plants, roots, and lichens, the bright yellows, reds, blues, and greens of which they were so fond. A finished Celtic cloak, woven in bold checks and fastened with a fine bronze brooch, was both a practical garment and a thing of beauty. Within the roundhouse, the daily work of the household turned upon a few simple tools, above all the quern, a pair of round stones between, which the grain was ground into flour by hand, turning day by day to make the daily bread. There was the loom against the wall, the cauldron over the fire, the storage jars and the baskets, the spindle and the needle. It was a simple life of patient handwork, each thing made and mended at home. The rhythms of grinding and spinning and weaving filling the long firelit hours. It is worth noting that the Celts wore trousers, which were unusual in the ancient Mediterranean world, where the Greeks and Romans wore robes and tunics with bare legs. Trousers were practical for riding and for the colder northern climate, and the Romans regarded them as a mark of the barbarian peoples to their north. Yet trousers were sensible and comfortable, well suited to riding and to cold weather. And in the end, it was the trousers of the northern peoples, not the toga of Rome, that the world would one day come to wear. A quiet victory of the practical Celtic garment. Across the long centuries, the Celts took great care over their appearance and were known to value cleanliness and grooming. The men often wore moustaches, sometimes long and drooping, and took pride in their hair. Both men and women adorned themselves with jewelry, with torcs, brooches, bracelets, rings, and beads of glass and amber and other materials. The brooches that fastened their cloaks were often cleverly made, working much like a modern safety pin, with a pin held under tension to grip the cloth and decorated with the swirling Celtic art. The Celts were skilled at making beads of coloured glass, swirled and spotted in bright patterns, and they treasured amber, the golden fossil resin traded down from the northern seas, wearing it as beads and amulets believed to hold a quiet, protective power. They are even credited with making fine soap from tallow and ashes, and the Romans are said to have learned of soap from the Celtic and Germanic peoples to their north. A small and homely gift from the so-called barbarians to the polished world of Rome. Now let us drift into the rich world of Celtic story and folklore. For though the Celts wrote little, their tales were later written down, especially in Ireland and Wales, and they are among the most beautiful and magical in all of Europe. These stories are filled with heroes and kings, with gods and goddesses, with magic and transformation, with quests and battles and journeys into the mysterious other world that lay alongside our own, at the heart of much Celtic belief and story was the other world, a realm of the gods and the dead and the spirits, a place of eternal youth, beauty, and plenty, where there was no sickness, no aging, and no want. It was not far away in the sky, but close at hand, just beyond a veil, reachable through certain hills, caves, lakes, and mists, especially at the turning times of the year. The other world lay always just alongside the everyday world, near and yet hidden. The Celts believed that certain green mounds and hills were doorways into this other world, the dwellings of a beautiful and powerful fairy people who lived beneath the earth. In Ireland, these were the mounds of the people, of the goddess, an ancient race who, in the old stories, had retreated into the hills when new peoples came and lived there still in a shining world beneath the green fields. From these beliefs grew the later folklore of the fairies and the little people. In Ireland, the old stories tell of an ancient and magical race called the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, said to have ruled the land in the deep past, before retreating into the hills and the other world. They were imagined as beautiful, gifted, and powerful, masters of magic and craft and poetry, and from them, in the old belief, came the fairy folk of later ages. Their stories form one of the great cycles of Irish myth. The old tales tell of great heroes, of a young warrior of incredible prowess named Cú Chulainn, who single-handedly defended his province against an invading army, and of Fionn mac Cumhaill, a wise and noble leader of a band of roving warriors and hunters, and of many kings and champions and their mighty deeds. There are tales, too, of the otherworld land of eternal youth, sometimes called Tir na Nog, the land of the young, where time moved differently and no one ever grew old, reached across the western sea or through the hollow hills. They tell of beautiful and powerful women, of Druids and their magic, of journeys to the other world, and of love and loss and wonder. These stories were told and retold by the firelight through the long evenings, and many survive to delight us still. In Wales, too, a great collection of old Celtic tales was later written, down, full of magic, transformation, and wonder, telling of enchanted kingdoms, of heroes and maidens, of talking animals and journeys into strange realms. These Welsh tales, with their deep roots in the ancient Celtic world, are among the treasures of European storytelling. The Celts loved tales of magic and shape-shifting, of people turned into swans or deer or other creatures, of cloaks of invisibility, of magical weapons and cauldrons, of spells and enchantments. The boundary between the human and the animal, between this world and the other world, was always thin and easily crossed in the Celtic imagination. Their stories shimmer with transformation and wonder, and with a sense that the magical was never far from the everyday. A famous figure of later Celtic folklore is a wailing spirit whose cry was said to foretell a death in a family. And there are countless tales of fairy folk who might help or hinder, who might bless a household or lead a traveller astray. The land itself was alive with spirits and meanings, with sacred places and haunted ones, with wells and stones and trees that held their own quiet powers. To walk through the Celtic landscape was to move through a world brimming with the unseen. Let us return for a time to the practical world and speak of where the Celts lived and how they built, while many lived in scattered farms. The Celts also built hillforts, large settlements set upon hilltops and ringed with banks and ditches of earth, sometimes with great timber walls atop them. These hill forts could shelter the people and their cattle in times of danger, and some grew into busy centres of population, trade, and craft, ringed by their mighty earthen ramparts. In their later days, especially in Gaul and Central Europe, some Celtic settlements grew into large fortified towns, ringed by great walls of timber and stone and earth, with streets, workshops, marketplaces, and the homes of many people. These towns were true centres of trade and industry, where craftsmen worked and merchants gathered, and where the Celts even minted their own coins of gold, silver, and bronze, often beautifully designed. They were the nearest thing the Celtic world had to cities, busy and prosperous places behind their great ramparts. The Celts of these towns struck handsome coins, at first copying the designs of Greek and Roman money, but soon transforming them in their own flowing style, until the borrowed images dissolved into the swirling, abstract, dreamlike patterns the Celts so loved. A horse or a head on a Celtic coin might melt into a beautiful tangle of curves and lines, the realistic picture giving way to the Celtic delight in pattern and motion. These little coins are small masterpieces of the Celtic eye. In the watery lands of Ireland and Scotland, some Celts built their homes upon small islands in lakes, sometimes natural and sometimes built up by hand from stones, timber, and earth. These lake dwellings, reached by a narrow causeway or by boat, gave safety and a measure of seclusion, surrounded by the protecting water. From their little island homes, the people could fish and tend their nearby fields, secure within the quiet ring of the lake. In the far north, in what is now Scotland, the Celts built tall, round towers of stone, hollow within, with cleverly built double walls and stairways winding up inside them. These great stone towers stood as strongholds and homes, and some of them still rise today, their dry stone walls standing after 2,000 years, without any mortar to hold them. They are among the finest pieces of ancient building in all of Northern Europe, raised by skilled hands long ago. The Celts were traders as well as farmers and warriors, and goods moved along their routes and to and from the wider ancient world. They traded in salt, in metals such as tin, copper, and gold, in furs and hides and woolen cloth, in fine craft work, and in slaves. From the Mediterranean they imported wine, which the Celtic nobles prized, and fine pottery and luxury goods. The Celtic lands were not isolated, but bound by trade into the wider web of the ancient world. The far southwest of Britain was especially rich in tin, metal needed to make bronze, and this tin was carried away by traders to the lands around the Mediterranean, so that the distant Celtic coasts were drawn into the commerce of the whole ancient world by the metal in their hills, amber from the cold northern seas, glowing and golden, was traded southward along ancient routes, and salt, gold, fine cloth, and skilled craft work all moved along the trackways and rivers and sea lanes of the Celtic world. There is a curious and homely proof of Celtic life still turning up in the peat bogs of Ireland and Scotland, where people long ago buried butter, packed in wooden vessels or wrapped in bark, sunk into the cool, airless bog to keep it, or perhaps as an offering. This bog butter has sometimes been found thousands of years later, preserved by the peat, a small and human trace of the daily life of a farming people who churned their milk into butter and stored it away in the cold dark of the bog. The Celts mostly counted and recorded by memory rather than by writing, but in their later days, some did begin to use letters, borrowing the alphabets of the Greeks and Romans to write down a few records, inscriptions, and names in their own tongues. And in Ireland, that early notched alphabet was developed for carving short inscriptions onto the edges of stones, but the great body of Celtic learning, lore, poetry, and story remained by long tradition in the living memory rather than on the written page. That early Irish writing, made of straight lines and notches cut across or beside a long edge, was simple and well suited to carving into wood or stone. Each letter was a group of strokes, and the inscriptions were read from the bottom upward. Most of the surviving examples are short, often just a name, carved upon a standing stone to mark a grave or a boundary. It was the first writing of the Irish, a quiet beginning of letters in the Celtic West. Now, let us speak of the long, slow ending of the ancient Celtic world, which came mostly through the rise of Rome. Over the course of a few centuries, the growing power of Rome conquered the Celtic lands. One by one, the Celts of Gaul, in what is now France, were conquered by the Roman armies under Julius Caesar. After a long and hard-fought war, near its end, the many tribes of Gaul united. For a time, under a single brave chieftain named Vercingetorix, who led them in a great revolt. But he was at last besieged and defeated, and Gaul passed under Roman rule. Caesar himself wrote an account of these wars, and it is, despite being the words of their conqueror, one of our most detailed windows into the ancient Celtic world. Britain, too, was largely brought under Roman rule in the centuries that followed, where Rome ruled. The Celtic ways slowly blended with Roman ones, and much of the old culture faded. But not all the Celtic lands fell under Rome, and this is why so much of the Celtic world survives. Ireland was never conquered by Rome, and so there, beyond the reach of the legions, the old Celtic culture, language, law, and story lived on and flourished for centuries longer. The far north of Britain, too, and the western edges kept much of their Celtic character. It is from these unconquered lands, above all from Ireland, that so much of what we know of the Celts has come down to us. In time, the Celtic lands became Christian, and in Ireland especially, the new faith blended gently with the old culture rather than sweeping it away. The monks of early Christian Ireland learned to write, and they wrote down many of the old tales and laws and poems that the Druids and bards had kept only in memory, preserving for us a great treasure of the Celtic world that would otherwise have been lost entirely. We owe much of our knowledge of the Celts to these patient writers. These Irish monks also created some of the most beautiful books ever made, richly decorated manuscripts in which the old, flowing, swirling Celtic art reached a new and dazzling height, covering the pages with intricate spirals, knots, and creatures in glowing colours and gold. The ancient love of pattern and curve, carried down from the Iron Age, blossomed once more upon the pages of these sacred books, joining the very old Celtic art to the new faith in lines of astonishing beauty. The same flowing art was carved into great standing crosses of stone raised across Ireland and the Celtic lands, their surfaces covered with intricate knotwork and spirals, and marked with a ring joining the arms of the cross, the famous Celtic cross that is still loved and made today. In these high crosses, as in the decorated books, the ancient Celtic delight in pattern lived on, carved patiently into stone that has weathered the rains of 1,000 years and more, standing yet in the green churchyards of the Celtic West. The Celts were also famous for their hospitality, holding it a sacred duty to welcome the traveller and the guest, to offer food, drink, and shelter to any who came, whether known or stranger. To turn away a guest or to fail in generosity was a deep disgrace, while open-handed generosity was among the most honoured of virtues. A stranger arriving at a Celtic home could expect to be fed and sheltered first, and only afterward asked who they were and what their errand. A gentle custom of welcome that ran deep in the Celtic world, and so the Celtic spirit was not extinguished, but transformed and carried forward, surviving in the living languages still spoken in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and beyond, in the old tales still told, in the music and the art, in the festivals that became our own holidays, and in the deep love of the land, and the unseen that runs through it all. The ancient Celts faded from history as a power, but their culture flowed onward, quietly, into the world we know. So we have wandered through the green and misty world of the ancient Celts, among their roundhouses and hillforts, their Druids and bards, their festivals and their gods, their swirling gold and their firelit tales. They were a people close to the land and the seasons, who trusted memory over writing, who saw the divine in the oak and the spring, and the turning of the year, and who left behind a beauty and a magic that lingers still. There is nothing now that you need to do, nothing to follow, nothing to hold. Let the old green world fade softly into the dark, the thatched roofs and the dying fires, the misty groves and the silent hills, while the slow night settles over the sleeping land of long ago. The fire burns low in the roundhouse. The harp falls silent. Mist gathers over the quiet green hills. Oak and firelight and the turning year. The old gods sleeping in the springs and stones. The other world close beyond the mist. Only the soft rain now, falling gently on the thatch, and the slow green land drifting down into sleep. Quiet, ancient, still,